Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, it's okay.
Cool, cool. Okay, so this is really based on an article I wrote, actually called "How Revolutionary Was the Irish Revolution?" in inverted commas. And actually, I more or less wrote it 2 years ago. Literally, I was writing on Christmas Day 2 years ago, and it ran quite long. I tried to place it in a journal, and it got knocked back. And it just sat around for a long while because I didn't want to cut it short. And journals are quite picky about how long articles should be. This one is way over normal length. But I did bung it to an art journal, and they finally got back this week saying they're going to publish it at the length, so that's good news. The reason I mention that is because it got knocked back, and even this time got some kind of unhappiness from the academics that sent it out to read it, because it is going against the grain a bit, because I'm questioning how much whether we should call the process by which Ireland became independent and partitioned should be considered a revolution. And that's become absolutely the standard term now, the Irish Revolution, when people talk about the period, maybe 1916, 1921, 1922, they talk about it as the Irish Revolution. And as one of the people who looked at the article said, it's not really trying to set up a new paradigm. The article is in essence destructive, because I'm questioning the applicability of the model of revolution to what happened in Ireland. And it's partly a kind of grumpy old man instinct which led me to do this. When I was young, back in the day, when I was at school and at university studying this kind of thing, nobody called what happened in Ireland at the time the Irish Revolution, or virtually nobody. It's a term which has become commonplace in the 1990s, and I think the reasons for that are interesting. And probably most importantly, people didn't really call the Irish Revolution a revolution as it was happening. If you look at the newspapers from about 1879 to about 1921, you find lots of references to the revolution in Ireland, or the Irish Revolution. But that's applied to the Irish Land War of 1879 to 82, which was a struggle, which in the long run successful, a social struggle primarily, as well as a political and national struggle, but a social revolution to destroy landlordism, which was successful and which is often described, not entirely unreasonably, as a revolution. People tended not to describe Irish independence and the partition of Ireland as a revolution at the time. There are exceptions to this. There was a book called The Revolution in Ireland by a bloke called Alison Phillips, who was a Cambridge, I think, historian. He kind of wrote contemporary history in about 1921 or thereabouts about what had happened in Ireland. And he called it The Revolution in Ireland. He wrote this in a very consciously reactionary way. And he is careful about why he used that name. He didn't use the Irish Revolution. He used the Revolution in Ireland because he wanted to take Ireland as an example of the kind of backwash of subversive Bolshevism. And he wasn't saying that Ireland was a Bolshevik revolution, but he's saying that Ireland was caught up in the Bolshevizing tendencies of the continent of Europe at this time. So he mostly wanted to make a reactionary point about how what was happening in Ireland should be considered part of the general post-war disorder of society, which had to be, which required a strong arm to set back on its feet. So the descriptors of revolution as applied to this period didn't stick around after it didn't come up very much in most of the decades of the 20th century. People, of course, were you remembered the events or one or two generations away from it. And the events came thick and fast. You had the Third Home Rule crisis, the Ulster crisis, as it's sometimes called, of 1912 to 14. You had the big labour movement lockout of 1913, the 1916 rebellion, the Anglo-Irish War of 1919 to 21, the Ulster Troubles, as they're called, of 1920 to 22, and then the 1922 to 23 Irish Civil War. So you can see how you might want a portmanteau term to cover all of these events. But people for a long time didn't feel that need because they're relatively close to the events, they thought of them as connected but discrete, but as separate. For almost 10 years now, we've had in Ireland what we call the decade of commemoration. And there's just endless commemorations of all these events. And to some extent, you can see the practical utility of the term Irish Revolution, because you need some overarching term. An Irish Revolution is what has emerged. But I think there is a feeling in Ireland now that people have always called it the Irish Revolution, and this isn't the case. It comes up episodically, but not much. The terms which tended to be used would be the Irish Uprising, or the conflict, or until 1969 or 1970 thereabouts, very often the Troubles was used to describe what had happened in Ireland in that period. Obviously, the Troubles got repurposed for what happened in Northern Ireland. Now, in the 1970s, you do begin to see the term Irish Revolution coming from the left, either so C. Desmond Greaves, a communist historian, spoke of the Irish Revolution as an incomplete national revolution. George Dangerfield, who's a kind of left liberal, also talks about the unfinished revolution. So you did occasionally hear it being used in the 1970s in the sense of an unfinished revolution, though notably it's not a term used by the provisional Republican movement. It's more people on the fringes of that. Really, the first time revolution is really stuck as a label on what happened in Ireland in an influential academic way was by J.G.A. Pocock, who is part of the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, which is a school of intellectual history which is really postmodernist but doesn't want to call itself that. It's pretty right-wing in its origins, though people like Garth Stedman Jones attach themselves to it. And Pocock was certainly writing about what happened in Ireland in an article from a pretty right-wing perspective. He compared what happened in Ireland to the national liberation struggles of the Third World at the time, and saw it as similarly as a bad thing. So he described the Irish Revolution, as he called it, the first terrorist war of modern times. And when he used the term terrorist, he was referring to the IRA, not to British forces. Tom Garvin, who's partly on the kind of centre-right of Irish historiography, took up the term from Pocock of the Irish Revolution and used it in a similar kind of fashion, analogizing radical nationalists in Ireland to the same social strata out of which comes fascism in the post-First World War period. So revolution really emerges in the 1970s primarily as a delegitimizing a label. It comes up, even then it's still in the fringes, people don't use the term very much. It begins to get more traction by the late 1980s. And at the time, I still think primarily as a delegitimizing strategy. We have to remember this is the time, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and there's a major historiographical offensive against what's broadly seen as the Marxist celebration of revolution. You have Simon Schama's history of the French Revolution, which is really going back to 19th century views of the savage masses. You get Orlando Fidges's history of the Russian Revolution, which is a very much better book, but same kind of angle. And so revolution in the late 1980s is seen to be something which is the unleashing of the savage masses by middle-class intellectuals who are drunk on the idea, on the fantasies of Marxism. So insofar as revolution is picked up and applied to Ireland, it's done with this sense of delegitimization. And of course, there's a major incentive to delegitimize what had happened at the time of Irish independence, because it's that tradition which the provisional IRA are drawing upon for their armed struggle at the time. George Boyce, is a good historian, but he wrote, he edited an essay collection on revolution in Ireland in 1988. And really his definition of revolution as applied to Ireland is simply that skullduggery was part of went on. It wasn't heroic. It was murderous and unpleasant and nasty, and therefore revolutionary. Things change in the 1990s, and I think it's probably something to do with what, in another context, I can't remember what context exactly, but Mike McNair's made the observation that really kind of, if you like, bourgeois attitudes to revolution change in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the color revolutions, CIA-sponsored revolutions of the late 90s, early 21st century. The notion of revolution again becomes kind of fashionable for the paragons of bourgeois society. Revolution also is something which is being softened considerably in its meaning on the left, the social identity left. Revolution becomes something which applies to sexuality, applies to personal liberty, it applies to culture, broadly speaking. So on the left, the concept of revolution has been very considerably, on the broad, liberal left, the concept of revolution is being softened. On the right, the concept of revolution is being differentiated. So you can have good revolutions, which are securely bourgeois and theoretically non-ideological, and ideally modeling themselves on a kind of fantasized idea of what the American Revolution had been like, or the Glorious Revolution. So revolution loses some of its bite in the 1990s and into the 21st century, which allows it to be increasingly applied to what happened in Ireland in a way which is neither a kind of reactionary condemnation of it, nor a sense of the uncompleted national revolution, but rather a celebration, if you like, of the establishment of what looked very much by the 1990s as a markedly successful bourgeois state. And Ireland, in the period of the Celtic Tiger, and indeed, broadly speaking, beyond, looks like a pretty successful bourgeois state. So Roy Foster, in his very influential book, Modern Ireland, talks about war and revolution in one chapter. He's still a bit ambiguous by what that means, but that really opens the floodgates. And within about a decade, everybody's talking about a revolution in Irish historiography, but really very little attempt to define what revolution means. The first and nearly the only serious attempt to do so was by Peter Hart in an essay written in 2002. Peter Hart is an American historian, very talented, very good historian, died tragically young, a controversial historian. He by and large sees the War of Independence in this paradigm of skullduggery, of one set of brutal killers against another, with perhaps the IRA having being rather more criminal than the Crown forces, probably roughly where he would have stood. So he owes something to the kind of Pocock tradition that revolution is brutal and nasty, which it must be said is quite distinct from the way Irish Revolution has been used for the last 10 years or so during the decade of commemorations, when generally speaking, Irish Revolution has been seen as a cool thing. Peter Hart borrowed from the sociological historian Charles Tilley the definition of revolution as an open division of sovereignty in which two distinct blocks make incompatible claims for control of the state. This obviously owes something to the Leninist notion of dual power, but it is a bit problematic because you get endless examples in history of states falling apart and a kind of dual authority between the centre and the periphery before some kind of central state control is. It's pretty much for much of the Middle Ages, that's kind of standard. Happens every time a king kicks the bucket. So it's a rather thin definition of revolution. Not everybody's very, very convinced with the Peter Hart interpretation. But really nobody else makes a very serious attempt to define what a revolution is to see whether it should apply to Ireland. Charles Townsend, a very good historian of all things Irish, particularly of this period, when he wrote about the Irish Revolution, he just kind of, in a weary way, he just decided to go along with the flow, because he said it remains plainly true that the events of the war and post-war period were felt by their proponents to be a revolution. Therefore, why not accept the term? But this really isn't the case, actually. If you look at newspapers at the time, as I mentioned earlier, you get lots of descriptions of the Irish Land War of the 1880s as a revolution, but not really of the period in which Ireland gained its independence and was partitioned. If you look at the Irish newspaper online archive, for example, which is pretty comprehensive, look at a collection of the newspapers, you get you get 102 hits for the term Irish Revolution. Sorry, 214 hits for the term Irish Revolution, but you get 458 hits for the term Irish Troubles, 833 hits for the term Tan War, and 2,542 hits for the term Anglo-Irish War. So overwhelmingly, Anglo-Irish War and terms like that are preferred at the time to the term Irish Revolution. If you look at the witness statements of Republican combatants in the War of Independence, gathered together by the state-sponsored Bureau of Military History in the 1930s and the 1940s, this is 1,773 witness statements and 334 sets of contemporary documents, all digitized. If you put in the term revolution, you get only 65 hits. And most of them are not actually talking directly about what happened in Ireland. They're talking as an aside about the French Revolution or the Glorious Revolution or something. So the Irish Revolution basically isn't used as a term by those who participated in the events. In fact, Kitty O'Doherty, who is a member of Cumann na mBan, which is kind of the female branch of the IRA, explicitly rejected the term revolution, saying that it was a British-inspired term of delegitimization. There is something to this. Major General Charles Fuchs, the director of British propaganda in Ireland from 1921, that was his official title, Director of British Propaganda, told his subordinates to depict the IRA as a gang of terrorists, a murder gang. He said, compare them to Lenin and Trotsky. So when revolution was used, it was a kind of delegitimizing strategy. So people didn't really describe the Irish Revolution as the Irish Revolution at the time. That doesn't mean you can't retrospectively use the term, of course. But you know, how should we use the term revolution? Now, the term revolution is not something you find in the wild. You know, it's not an objective fact. It's a label, and exactly how you define something as revolution. Well, you get as many different definitions, no doubt, as you get people who talk about the term. But I think you can, looking at the wider literature and thinking about revolution, you can come up with a set of typical revolutionary processes or revolutionary characterizations, which will not apply to everything you can reasonably call a revolution. But if none of them apply, then you really have to wonder whether you are talking about a revolution. I came up with 10 characterizations. I'm going to quickly go through them and see to what extent they might apply to Ireland. First of all, it's often argued that revolutions happen when the state coercive apparatus breaks down under pressure of international events. Very obviously, the collapse of the domestic coercive power of the Russian state, for example, because of the First World War. The the state apparatus is overwhelmed by a conscript army which is not enthusiastic for putting down domestic revolution. Therefore, revolution happens in Russia, to be very brief about it. Did Britain's coercive power collapse anywhere at the end of the First World War? Well, no, it clearly didn't. You know, in 1918, the British Army was undoubtedly, you know, the most effective army in the world. You know, it is extremely effective. It is, and there's no collapse of coercive power on the part of the state. And the Crown government doesn't collapse in Ireland. It can still run the place without, frankly, breaking sweat. It does have severe political difficulties in Ireland, but it doesn't have a collapse of its coercive power. Now, when President Wilson came into the war, he made all these noises about the right of small nations to self-determination. People said, oh, well, that means Ireland should be able to have self-determination. But Wilson made very clear, no, 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 this does not apply to those powers which won the war. It doesn't apply to Britain. So there's no significant pressure on international pressure on Britain to give up its a colonial power. There's no significant pressure on it from other state actors to get out of Ireland. So there's no collapse of Britain's coercive power. Another obvious characterization of revolution is the eruption of the masses into the political arena. In Ireland, actually, the masses are very frequently erupting into the political arena, going back at least to the O'Connellite period of the 1820s and 1830s, of Catholic emancipation and the repeal movement. And at every generation, there's very big popular mobilizations in Ireland. To some extent, so you can make an argument, I won't make it here, but you can make an argument that Ireland kind of invents modern popular politics. But the Irish War of Independence period is not particularly characterized with this kind of mass mobilization. If you look at the 1916 rebellion, it's a rebellion by a small cadre. Eamon de Valera famously bemoaned after the event, if only the people had come out, even armed only with knives and forks. Point being, the people didn't come out in 1916, nor were they invited out. And as the War of Independence developed, mass mobilization is not particularly important in the cutting edge of the struggle, which is the struggle against the IRA, an underground or semi-underground, a army organization, not a mass movement. On the one hand, Crown forces on the other. Peter Hart makes this point, but he doesn't really recognize that this detracts from the idea of what happened in Ireland as being a revolution. You do, of course, get mass demonstrations, but what's kind of characterizes mass demonstrations in Ireland is actually the vigil or the rosary. It's women gathering outside jails because there's IRA men inside on hunger strike. That's the kind of characteristic demonstration in Ireland during the period of the War of Independence. And it's certainly the international impression it gives. It's not long since the 100th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And in a way, Bloody Sunday is emblematic of this period. There is a large crowd involved, but it's a crowd which is watching a football match when they're fired upon by the British Army. What also happens on Bloody Sunday is a kind of clinical series of assassinations carried out by the IRA on the Squad, which is a gang of police undercover agents in Dublin. It's pretty neatly carried out militarily. It's all kinds of military justifications behind it, but it's not the eruption of the masses into the political arena. Third point, revolutions tend to be characterized by class conflict. Obviously, we tend to associate this with Karl Marx, but you can equally associate it with Aristotle and Thucydides. It's a long-standing definition of revolution, that they tend to be characterized by class conflict of some sort. There is class conflict to a degree during the War of Independence. There's an anecdote I kind of like. It's given by a bloke called Lionel Fleming, who was the son of a scion of the Unionist family in Ireland, and who remembers the story told to him by his Unionist landowning father. And the father said he had a tea party during the War of Independence. And at this tea party in the big house, the big country house, he invited the local officers of the British Army. And the British officer turns up at this tea party and he gets a bit drunk and he starts going on about how a local landowner was a good chap because he'd given him useful information to do with the IRA in the locality. Somebody else in the tea party says to the officer, excuse me, you should maybe quieten down a bit. And the officer says, well, we're all friends here, you know. This is a tea party of well-off Unionists. This is fine. What the officer had forgotten about is that there was a parlour maid who was serving them tea. And of course, within a day or two, the landowner who'd given the information to the British Army is forced out of the country with the local IRA. Why? Because the parlour maid had passed on the intelligence that this guy was an informer. So this is class conflict, if you like, at a tea party, and it's illustrative of a certain dynamic of the War of Independence. But you can't go much further than that, to be honest. The land war of the 1870s, 1880s had been a major class struggle, but the land war is more or less over by the time of the Anglo-Irish War. Why? Because the peasantry had already won. Landlordism had already been liquidated in Ireland, and the peasants owned their own farms. So there is a bit of class struggle between landless labourers and farmers in particular during the War of Independence. There's also a pretty significant wages movement, but none of this is really a driving dynamic of the main political struggles of the period, which is around the national question. And IRA certainly didn't present itself as taking one side or the other in the class struggle as it was going on at the time. So the class struggle was present, but it was not a driver. To some extent, the class struggle happens because the state is distracted by the IRA, and also because of what's happening internationally, but it's not a driver. And I think even if we look at the Dublin lockout of 1913, and we look at James Connolly and look at the labour movement, we need to be careful not to exaggerate the influence of the labour movement in radicalising Irish nationalism. A priest at the time, he gave evidence, he gave an account after the War of Independence. He said, you know, people talk about the labour troubles of 1913. But the influence of labour is nothing near as important as the influence of those plain Irish boys who'd been educated by the Irish Christian brothers. And in fact, that stands up pretty well. There has been a kind of sociological survey of those who are members of the IRA, and being taught by the Irish Christian brothers seems to be the most significant factor on whether you end up being in the IRA. And what the Irish brothers taught was certainly not socialism. They taught a militant form of nationalism. And this is what motivates the War of Independence. The labour movement doesn't stand against Sinn Féin in the 1918 election for various reasons, but partly because they done so, I don't think many Labour people would have got elected. Rather, they would have split the radical separatist vote. So Labour really takes a back seat during the War of Independence. And by the end of 1918, Sinn Féin, which presents itself as more than a political party, it presents itself as the nationalist people. And they do represent the great mass of the population in nationalist Ireland, of all classes and of all ages. Even middle class Catholics by 1918 are identifying with Sinn Féin. George O'Brien, who himself was a pretty middle class nationalist, remembers parties with rebels of genteel outlooks and upper class accents who are saying, yeah, Sinn Féin's great, you know. Now, as the War of Independence developed, if you like, the hard men of the IRA do move to the fore, the middle classes move backwards. Even in these circumstances, though, you can still see class hierarchies within the IRA. So Dan Green, who is an IRA militant, remembers country lads with neither financial nor social standing would choose for themselves commandants of their local IRA units whose qualifications would provide necessary prestige. So while certainly IRA combatants are not drawing upon the bourgeoisie in any very significant way, nonetheless, within the IRA, you still have class hierarchies in existence. And the IRA is not self-consciously attempting to undermine the class hierarchy. Fourth characterization of revolutions is revolutions are a process, something Marx, as well as others, pointed out. The revolutions often begin with near unanimity, but then tends to radicalize, and in radicalizing, you get a kind of dialectical reaction or a dialectic process of radicalization and reaction feeding off each other. And so what you get in the early revolution, it's always springtime, it's always kind of unity against against the crown, whatever it happens to be. But as a revolution develops, you get radicalization on the one hand, developing reaction on the other. And this is a characteristic process of revolution, a mutual radicalization of revolution and reaction. And this really doesn't happen very much in the Irish case. You can see an element of it early on, but it's an element which dies off because really by about 1917, Southern Irish Unionism has realized that they have lost political authority in Ireland. They've realized that they can no longer call the shots. So Southern Irish Unionism is extremely important up until about 1916, 1917. In fact, Southern Irish Unionism prevents a moderate home rule settlement for decades, really. And they have this blocking power. It's not the only factor, and there's also British Unionism, but Southern Irish Unionism has an important blocking power up until about 1916, 1917. 1917, 1918, they suddenly realized that they're faced with something much worse than home rulers. They're faced by Sinn Féin. And they realized that they're going to be abandoned one way or another by Britain, that they politically collapse very, very rapidly. So reaction within Ireland doesn't develop and therefore, radicalize at the other side. Reaction collapses really quite quickly. Ulster Unionism, of course, does retain its strength, but it behaves in a particular way. It doesn't really struggle directly with Irish nationalism. Instead, it seeks separation from Irish nationalism. It seeks partition. So in that sense, you don't get a struggle between nationalism and unionism, which leads to mutual radicalization of revolution or reaction. Instead, you get the collapse of Southern Irish Unionism and the separation of Ulster Unionism. In this sense, you don't have that pressure, you don't have that dialectic which radicalizes Irish nationalism. Which leads to point 5, which is very common in the revolutionary process, is the radicalization of revolutionary leadership, which usually starts pretty moderate with Kerensky, ends up with not moderate Lenin, that kind of deal, So is there a radicalization of Irish nationalism? To some extent, obviously, yes, because home rule is superseded by separatism. Home rule movement is succeeded by Sinn Féin, which wants a radical an Irish Republic, not simply a devolved a parliament in Ireland. Nonetheless, there's more continuity between the old nationalism and the new nationalism than is often appreciated. Augustine Birrell, who is the British Chief Secretary of Ireland, he wrote a report in the aftermath of the 1916 rebellion. And what he says in this report, amongst other things, quote him, he says, "The spirit of what is today called Sinn Féinism is mainly composed of old hatreds and distrust of the British connection, always noticeable in all classes and in all places, varying in degree and finding different ways of expression, but always there as the background of Irish politics and character." And there is something to this, you know. I think it's not appreciated, the degree to which Ireland is self-consciously held against its will by Britain long before 1916. As far back as 1886, Gladstone wrote about Ireland, and Gladstone said that Ireland was unique among all the portions of the empire. Why? Well, he said because all the rest are held together by free will. Ireland alone is held under the bond of force. Now, I'm sure other bits of the empire might dispute whether they're held by free will, but there is actually something distinct there, that organised political nationalism in Ireland really predates anti-colonialism anywhere else in the Second British Empire. And this nationalism, of course, is a home rule nationalism. It is only seeking a domestic parliament in Ireland. It's not seeking absolute separation. But I don't think this really reflects what people in Ireland wanted in the 19th century. Home rule reflected what Irish people thought they could get. And the ethic of Irish nationalism, long before 1916, went way beyond devolution. The ethic of nationalism in Ireland, of popular nationalism, was always instinctively separatist. A unionist polemicist, a British unionist, writing in the 1880s, a guy called A.V. Dicey, 1886, was criticising Gladstone's scheme for home rule for Ireland. And he says, look, the arguments in favour of home rule were, in political logic, all arguments in favour of Irish independence. And that actually is true. That's why unionism was so opposed to home rule. They would have accepted home rule if they thought that was going to be the end of the game. But they saw home rule as the thin edge of the wedge. They saw home rule as something which would inevitably lead to separation, because they didn't believe that Irish nationalists genuinely wanted home rule in itself. Irish nationalists wanted home rule as a step and as a wedge towards greater independence, leading to separation. And I think the Irish Unionists are absolutely right about this. This is what home rule meant. It was conceived at a popular level as a way to get maximal independence now, and leave open the path to something much further, ultimate separation in the future. In fact, Parnell, the leader of home rule in the 1880s, more or less said as much. No man, he said, has the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. We have never attempted to fix the ne plus ultra to the progress of Irish nationhood, and we never shall. And it's significant when they stuck up a statue of Parnell in Dublin in about 1910, I think. That's the quote that the Home Rulers put on the statue. They took the most separatist thing that Parnell ever said and stuck it on the statue. So the Irish Unionists were not unreasonably said, look, home rule will never satisfy Irish nationalism, because Irish nationalism is instinctively separatist. And I think they're right. If you look at Irish home rule speeches, they're often very militant. They are always celebrating things like the 1798 United Irishmen Rebellion. And the defence of home rule is primarily a pragmatic defence. It's the most you can get off the Brits now. The First World War changes that logic in ways I'll not go into now, but the First World War makes home rule as a strategy less persuasive. If for nothing else, as long as you've only got home rule, you might be involved in Britain's next World War, and you'd rather not be. Moreover, the First World War raises the issue of the self-determination of small nations. So really what happens in the First World War is that it's not that nationalism is radicalized in any very profound sense, but rather the balance of calculation changes, and actual Republican separation now seems at least as achievable as home rule. So why not just go for what you actually want? Okay. Yeah, so Hegarty, who was a kind of right-wing propagandist for the Sinn Féin movement during the War of Independence, interesting chap, ends up being kind of quasi-fascist in the 1930s, but leaving that aside. But he, in a defense of Sinn Féin at the time, published in, when was it? In 1919, he said, practically any generation of Irish men are liable to be drawn to a separatist movement if the separatists should develop a sufficiently attractive and workable policy. And I think, broadly speaking, that's right. What happens in the period after the First World War, or during the First World War, is not that people who had previously been in their heart home rulers become in their heart separatists. It's rather nationalists see the balance of the achievable as changing. Okay, moving on to the next point, what characterizes revolution. Coercion to create constituencies. Revolutions tend to see not two armies lined up confronting each other at the beginning, but rather a struggle in order to create a revolutionary constituency, and of course a struggle on the other side to create a reactionary constituency. Revolutions are about a struggle to win hearts and minds. The Irish Revolution, if we call it that, actually sees very little of that. What happens is that the Home Rule vote on this kind of pragmatic, these pragmatic grounds, goes over entirely to Sinn Féin, more or less entirely goes over to Sinn Féin. Nationalists remain nationalist. They just have a different kind of strategy. The IRA is not interested in using its the IRA does not behave as, if you like, a political militia. So if you look, for example, at Ho Chi Minh or Tito, the advice they give to their guerrilla units, they're always talking about the importance of political work. The IRA don't talk about the importance of political work because they're not trying to win people over to a political line. They take for granted that nationalist Ireland accepts the political line. And they're not trying to win over recalcitrant unionists because they think the recalcitrant unionists are not winnable. So the Irish War of Independence is not like national wars of liberation in different contexts, where the armed struggle is also a political struggle to convince or coerce people to accept a political line. The IRA rather behaves in a much more purely military fashion. And the guerrilla struggle, therefore, is very distinct from the guerrilla struggle of the Viet Minh or even the partisans of Yugoslavia. The guerrilla struggle in Ireland develops more or less in purely military lines. That is, you can't confront the British Army in a stand-up fight. You have to preserve your forces. You have to do hit and run. So the IRA kind of discovers or invents the modern guerrilla war as a method of national liberation, but it's distinct from those guerrilla wars which succeeded because it's not significantly a political struggle to create a political constituency. The political constituency is taken for granted. The guerrilla struggle is developed by the circumstances of the military balance of forces within Ireland. So as Florence O'Donoghue, who is an IRA commander, remembered, guerrilla idea came to be accepted. It meant the initiative was in our hands, but tactics had to be employed to combine the elements of speed, surprise, and success. Evasion was essential to survival. The columns, IRA columns, had to be kept in the field. Local initiative had to be retained, so on and so forth. None of it is about, and we have to corral the local people around the political line. That's taken entirely for granted. And so if you look at the kind of guerrilla, kind of armed struggles happening in Eastern Europe at the same time at the end of the First World War, which has been written about by various people recently, the war after the war. There you see an enormous amount of violence directed against the civilian population, because one side or the other is using violence to try and force the civilian population to take sides. And so they attack those who are in the middle to force them to either join the revolution or the counter-revolution, you know. In Ireland, that doesn't happen. In Ireland, the civilian population is not exposed to intimidation by IRA in any very significant political sense, because civilian loyalty is taken for granted. There is intimidation of the civilian population by IRA, but purely for pragmatic military purposes, i.e. to prevent people talking too much, to stop intelligence getting to the Crown forces. So you get a moderate amount of intimidation, execution of informers, that kind of stuff, but not the political intimidation of the civilian population, because it's not required. For this reason, the Irish War of Independence and even the violence in Northern Ireland at the time is very, very low body count. In the Irish War of Independence, strictly speaking, there's about 2,000 fatalities. It's really small compared to what's happening in Eastern Europe or Finland or places like that at the same time. Why? Because there's no reason to attack the civilians, to force civilian populations to take sides. They've taken sides already. Another characteristic of revolution, characteristic 7, is that revolutionaries tend to purge and reconstitute the state apparatus. So this is one of the reasons why revolutions tend to be traumatic. For revolutions to work, you have to purge, you have to destroy the existing apparatus. If the revolution doesn't do that, the existing apparatus will destroy you. On a very small scale, we've seen that with the Labour Party. Because Corbynism didn't take on the apparatus in the Labour Party, the apparatus survives and carries out, in effect, a counter-revolutionary coup against the rank and file, which is really what's happening now with, in the Labour Party. On a much bigger scale, that's what happens in revolutions and counter-revolutions. That's why counter-revolutions normally win, because the state apparatus is not demobilized, is not purged and not demobilized, because to do so is extremely destabilizing. So revolutions, to be successful outside particular circumstances, they need to tear apart the state apparatus, to purge it and to build it up again. To do that is extremely destabilizing, which is why revolutions often bring about an element of societal collapse. So that's part of the typical revolutionary trauma. That really doesn't happen in Ireland. The reason for this actually is because the state apparatus has been transforming for a long time. The lower ranks of the state apparatus in Ireland are already largely colonized by Catholic nationalists by about 1914. Matthew Nathan, the Undersecretary of Ireland, who's the guy in charge of the civil service, in 1914 says, "For some reason I am unable to fathom a large proportion of people treasonable to England, patriotic to Ireland, they would say, are to be found in the lower ranks of government service." From 1916, coming under pressure from political events in Ireland, The British even start letting Irish nationalists into the upper ranks of the civil service. And so the state apparatus, excluding obviously direct representatives of the British government from London, but they just come in and leave again. The state apparatus, the people who run things in Ireland, by the time of the War of Independence, they're already nationalists, broadly speaking, you know. So it means that when Ireland becomes independent, there's very little that needs to be done to the state apparatus. It is not sufficiently purged. It's not significantly purged. A 1923 review of the civil service, the senior civil servant told the new Irish independent, mostly independent government, he said, this review will not necessitate very much time or inquiry. Why? Because there's not much to do. There's no trauma in the Irish state apparatus. It's not significantly purged. It's not significantly reconstituted because it doesn't have to be. You don't have that typical revolutionary process. Point 8 of a typical revolution. This is in a minority, so not typical maybe, but what happens in a minority of revolutions is a significant transformation in the mode of production, or at least the allocation of property. A social revolution does that. It doesn't happen in Ireland. Not because there wasn't, well, in Ireland, the social revolution had already happened. It had happened with the Irish Land War, which the land war itself and the aftermath over a period of time liquidates landlordism. Landlordism is destroyed by a quasi-revolutionary movement in Ireland, beginning in the 1870s, culminating in the 1903 Wyndham Land Act. And what you have established in Ireland is, in effect, a property-owning democracy. What we call now the Irish Revolution doesn't require this kind of social it doesn't require it doesn't have a significant social property aspect. Had the land war not happened, then the Irish War of Independence probably would have led to landlords being hanged from trees and lampposts. Yes, it probably would have looked like a social revolution. It probably would have been a violent social revolution, which would have established through a considerable trauma of violence and social conflict, a kind of petty bourgeois republic. But that doesn't happen because landlordism has already been liquidated. You do get social struggles during the War of Independence, a semi-syndicalist wages movement. You get certain talk, not just in Irish Labour movement, but in Sinn Féin, of a cooperative commonwealth, which is perceived in different ways. But those who favour the cooperative commonwealth, they say all that needs to be put off until the English have left Ireland. And what you get out of Ireland is the removal of the landed elite, the removal of, perhaps, of, if you like, blow-in British bourgeois. But the rest of Irish society is able to engage in this happy idea that they're all one generation away from the land. And so the Irish independent state is almost depicted as classless. It really isn't classless. But the fact that it's successfully depicted as classless to a large extent just shows to the degree to which the Irish Revolution doesn't really have the social revolutionary dynamic. Point 9, second last point, revolutions often in some kind of ideological way establish a new kind of ideology. A new legitimizing ideology of the state. Let's say they get rid of divine rights and replace it with the notion of the crown and parliament of parliamentary government, as you have in England. So divine rights replaced by parliamentary government through the English Civil Wars and the Glorious Revolution. You don't really have the same ideological re-legitimization of Ireland. What's dominant in Irish political discourse before 1916 is nationalism. What's dominant after 1916 is nationalism. And the nationalism itself doesn't particularly radicalize. Irish nationalism in the 1920s is more culturalist, Gaelicist than it had been, let's say, in the 1860s. Most of that cultural Gaelicism, most of that change of ideology, it actually happened in the generation before 1960. A lot of attention in the last 10 years has been paid to the kind of feminist aspects of the Irish Revolution, which are not absent, but they do tend to be exaggerated. Whatever the Irish state is produced in 1921, it's not a notably feminist state. Women have the vote share, but women have the vote in Britain at the same time. It's very difficult to see the Irish state ideologically radicalized in the direction, say, of feminism. It really just goes along with the Western European current. So what did happen in Ireland? I should come to an end now. As I said at the beginning, this paper and this talk is mostly destructive. That is, I'm not really that anxious to set up a new paradigm. It's mostly destructive. It's mostly saying that I'm not so sure that revolution is such an ace term to apply what happened in Ireland. What I would suggest, however, is that the combatants on the side of the IRA and increasingly on the side of the British at the time, they look upon it as a war. It's a war between the British nation and the Irish nation. The border of that war, to some extent, runs not just up and down the Irish Sea, it also runs through the 6 counties of what becomes Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, it's seen as a conflict between 2 nations. The IRA always sees itself not as a political army, but as the armed wing of the Irish state. And the Dáil Éireann, the Parliament of Ireland, which was established in 1918, sees itself as the legitimate government of Ireland, not just the de facto government, not just the de jure government of Ireland, but as the de facto government of Ireland. From 1918, they see the Crown forces had always been illegitimate occupiers of Ireland, but worse than that, in 1918, the Crown forces are refusing to recognise the legitimate authority of the Dáil. Therefore, the IRA is acting as an army should do, which is to expel the invader. Increasingly, actually, the British government comes to see it in the same way. De Valera, as president of Dáil Éireann, describes the IRA as a regular state force, as a national army of defence, and he denies that it's a Praetorian Guard of a political army. Tom Barry, a leading commandant of the IRA, describes the IRA as the army of the Republic, with the moral and legal status of a lawfully organised army of the democratic government. British observers at the time increasingly recognised this, what they call the military spirit and the discipline of the IRA. Charles Street, who's information officer for the British administration, told his government that it must be remembered from the outset that the various Republican organisations considered themselves as a directing force of the de facto Irish Republic, of which the government was Dáil Éireann, and the policy, the conduct of war on the British Empire in general, and the forces of the Crown in particular. So this isn't really perceived at the time as a situation of war. Rather, it's perceived at the time as an occupation of an independent state, and the independent state expelling the occupying power. As I mentioned earlier, increasingly the British government in effect comes to see it the same way. So in May 1920, Sir Dennis Henry, the Attorney General of Ireland, told the House of Commons that what was at stake was an ongoing assault on British power in Ireland. He said, it is not an attack on one party. It is not an attack on the coalition government in Britain. It is an attack on your nation. It is an attempt to drive your nation out of Ireland. And just over a year later, Lord Birkenhead told the House of Lords that the events in Ireland amounted to a small war. I think actually that's a pretty good description. It's a small war. The left Fabian Margaret Cole wrote in 1949 in her memoirs, she said, the Irish War was ended, of course, largely because the bulk of the English public were ashamed of what has been done in their name and quite unprepared for the real war, which would have been needed to reconquer Ireland. Now, there was revolutionary potential in this period of the War of Independence. To some extent, they did develop somewhat in the Civil War period, but they didn't develop that much because the Civil War came to an end. At the end of this period, Sinn Féin breaks apart into two government-seeking umbrella parties, Come na Gael on one side and Fianna Fáil on the other. Really, it's what you would have expected to happen to Home Rule, the Home Rule Party, if it ever got their own parliament. One would have divided into two parties, one pressing towards maximal independence as quickly as possible, the other being a bit more careful about the speed at which one should go towards unfettered Irish sovereignty. But I think there's no doubt at all that a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland would have evolved towards independent separation. There's no question about that. What happened instead, though, was a war to bring this about. It is not so much that Ireland had undergone a profound revolution, or that Britain had lost a war. Thank you.